Glauber is with us, so that's fantastic. So we're now ready to go. Joe, can you hear us?
Great.
I unmute everyone. Hang on. Yes, and Joe Glauber is with us, so that's fantastic. So
sorry, I have no idea what's. Well, I think I've been on so many Zoom meetings that it was defaulting to another one, so I apologize.
Anyway, thank you very much for joining us. This is a very timely topic. As most of you probably have seen this week, the World Food Programme issued a stark warning to the UN Security Council that 250 million people may go hungry very soon due to this ongoing pandemic. So obviously, when we talk about food, we have to talk about food trade, and we have this great pleasure today to have some of the most experienced professionals in food trade. I'd like to start with Joseph Glauber. Joe Glauber is currently a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute and a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Prior to joining IFPRI, Glauber spent over 30 years at the US Department of Agriculture, including as chief economist from 2008 to 2014. And as chief economist, he was responsible for the department's agricultural forecasts and projections, oversaw climate, energy, and regulatory issues, and served as chairman of the board of directors of the Federal Crop Insurance Corporation. From 2007 till 2009, Glauber was the special Doha agriculture envoy at the Office of US Trade Representative, where he served as chief agricultural negotiator in the Doha talks. Karl Hausmann is our next speaker. He was managing director of global government and corporate affairs of Bunge Limited, a leading global agribusiness and food company from 2010 until his retirement in 2012. Prior to that, he was the CEO of Bunge Europe and then Bunge North America. He has served as the vice chair of the Consortium of International Agricultural Research Centers, CGIAR, a global partnership that unites organizations engaged in research for a food-secure future, also of Biodiversity, which is one of the 15 member centers in the CG system. Ulla Kask, as our next speaker, is a counselor in the Agriculture and Commodities Division at the World Trade Organization and in charge of the Committee in Agriculture special session, for example, negotiations. All her professional career has been dedicated to international trade issues. For the past decade, her work has been dedicated to WTO agricultural negotiations, with a specific focus on agricultural support and food security, to the implementation of trading rules, as well as to environmental and gender-related issues in agriculture. Ulla is also called to participate in WTO disputes related to agriculture, which is of course very timely at this moment in history. Riddell is the special advisor to Egypt's Minister of Water and Irrigation and leader of the EU-funded Water Sector Technical Assistance and Reform Support Project. Phil is a well-known international researcher and advisor on water policy and sector investment strategy with almost 45 years extensive experience working in the irrigated agriculture and natural resources sectors. He's also the author on behalf of FAO of the white paper on water, food and nutrition security for the G20 group of agricultural ministers. And finally, and last but not least, we have Eckart Woertz, who is director of the Institute for Middle East Studies at the GIGA, German Institute for Global and Area Studies in Hamburg, Germany, and also professor for contemporary Middle East history at the University of Hamburg. He's also a non-resident senior research associate at CEDOC, which is the Barcelona Center for International Affairs, and his research interests comprise the political economy of the Middle East and North Africa, energy issues and food security. And he has become, or has made his name, because he wrote this highly acclaimed book, All for Food, published by Oxford University Press. In terms of house rules today, what we're going to do is we're going to have first a round of introductions or introductory statements, which will be then followed by moderated questions. And then thereafter, you will all have the opportunity to raise your questions. Ideally, you can send a message in the chat option within Zoom. Also, if you like, you can send me an email or you can Twitter us under Food Security Program at AUB. But please go ahead and ask questions because we would like to make it as lively as possible. I will then give you all, or those of you who are interested, speaking rights so you can then ask your question. Let me hand over to Rachel, who is going to moderate the next section.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I'm Rachel Bahn. I'm the coordinator of the Food Security Program at AUB. So at this point, I'm going to be the one to invite each of our distinguished speakers to take about 4 to 5 minutes and present your take on this issue of how COVID-19, how the pandemic is affecting food trade and food systems. So if we can turn first to Joe Glauber, and we'll hear from you first, please. Joe, are you there? Okay, it looks like Joe's camera may have frozen, perhaps indicating a connection issue. So maybe what we should do is we'll jump in the order to the next speaker, to Carl Hausmann, and then we'll bring Joe back towards the end. Joe, are you back with us? Great. Joe, are you back with us? Joe? Okay. So it looks like we're having some, Joe, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes, I'm back.
Great. Okay, welcome back. If
This
you
is like no, I won't go in.
We're going to get you first before we have any further connection issues. So we're going to ask you to take your first 4 to 5 minutes to introduction.
Okay, and I'm just going to, I'll talk very quickly about how food trade's been influenced by the pandemic, particularly short run. And I think that, for developed countries, we're really talking 2 issues. One is the problem of the illness itself, particularly for labor-intensive activities. So if you look at fruit and vegetable production or dairy production, things where a lot of workers are in close quarters, there's been concerns there. I think the bigger issues, however, have been in the points of aggregation, like meat and poultry processing plants, where you've seen a lot of in the US now, I think something like 15% of the pork processing production is shut down because of COVID outbreaks in several of the large processing plants. Also some issues with we've read about issues on distribution, so pork facilities, other things. But the bigger problems, I think, are problems of containment and mitigation efforts for COVID. So all of these lockdown procedures that have forced restaurants to close and other things have forced a change from food distribution from going to restaurants, where in the US, for example, 50% of food expenditures are at home and about 50% away from home. And so there's been a big disruption because they aren't packaged in the same quantities. They are going to different warehouses. And as a consequence, what we've seen is retail prices have increased and because this is imposing a fairly large cost in the middle of the system. And at the processing level or at the producer level, they've fallen a lot. And again, some of this due to the disruption with the meat and poultry processing plants. But I think these are hopefully fairly temporary in duration. I mean, assuming that the coronavirus is brought under control through testing and biosecurity protocols and ultimately vaccinations. In developing countries, I think the issue is a little different. It's and mainly because the outbreaks have been less. We are seeing some countries now emerge as with their own hotspots, but for the most part, a lot of countries have tried to put in mitigation efforts. And so they do have containment policies like lockdowns. We've seen in the case of India, for example, where it's been very difficult to have movement of both people, but also goods as well. And so that's been a big issue. The thing that I think that my organization, IFPRI, has been watching and others have been watching are the policy reactions that some countries have had to the virus. And I think to date, we've tracked about 15 or so countries that have imposed export restrictions. Thankfully, they represent a very, very small part of global food trade, about less than 1% of global food trade. Some of the more concerning ones have been by Ukraine and Russia, which of course are very large exporters. But those actions are not expected, their own actions within those countries, they've set quotas on how much will be exported over the next month or two. They are not expected to constrain trade. Vietnam, which is a big rice producer, also an exporter, also put in some restrictions, but they've since rescinded those actions. So I think that it's really a big issue and we're certainly concerned about it, but hopefully we've seen the worst of the export restrictions and they won't get worse.
Okay, Joe, thank you very much for your intervention. We're going to turn now to our next speaker, Karl Hausmann. If you'd like to take the floor and provide your introductory statement, please.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. Good day to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. While the subject matter of our conference is COVID-19 and the global food chain, I'd like to construct my comments under the banner of population increase and globalization. I was born onto a planet with a population of 3 billion and expect to leave this world when our population will be over 9 billion. While the challenge of feeding our global community forces us to work together on a global scale, globalization, at least in my opinion, started not with food concerns, but represents the movement that started looking for global economic opportunities, and in fact has been very successful in growing our global GDP. While we have been successful at growing our global GDP, that has come at a cost. Environmental cost on the one hand, and the cost of national solidarity on the other. I think we know that national solidarity decreases as some portion of the population benefits from globalization, while another portion suffers from the challenges of globalization. Therefore, societal governance, both national and international, is increasingly under stress and getting harder. The challenge of COVID-19 is just the latest challenge that our global society is struggling with. Today's national governments are pushing the world into several xenophobic corners. Today, our neighbors scare us. We don't trust them. There are increasing calls for national manufacturing strategies in the US, in China, and I believe they will follow in Europe. They will become the cause du jour. Yet let's be clear, our biggest challenges are indeed global in nature and can't be solved by isolationism. Climate change, combating pandemics, food security, etc. They all require us to think globally. So how will this play out? Let me say, in general, I'm a believer in market-based capitalism. Markets work and the signals of what food commodities to produce have been heard, and the world has been well supplied over the past 20 years. 20 years ago at a conference like this, everyone was asking the question whether our markets could meet the global requirements. No one is asking that question today. Of course, there will always be challenges year on, year out, but markets work better than any other alternative. Now, let me be clear on this next point. This does not mean that markets do not need government-imposed regulations that correspond to society needs. They need them, and they will accept them. Smart regulations make markets respect environmental requirements and the protection of those citizens in need. While not all regulations are good, the business sector is used to regulations, and regulations can always be adjusted. In fact, the rule of law puts business sector at ease as long as they know what to expect. Since I have been retired for some 3 years now, I have no well-informed comments on today's effects of COVID-19 on the current market. What I can say is that the US soybean processing volumes remain strong and the animal feed markets are well supplied. Bulk grain activity is not a labor-intensive process, and accordingly it should stay robust. South American exports are also flowing smoothly, and expectations in South America for an increase in next year's planned acreage. On the other hand, fresh food processing is more labor intensive. I have seen reports of COVID-19 outbreaks in pork processing and chicken processing labor pools, which are requiring some plants to idle while the labor force is reduced. Joe also spoke about the same phenomenon. Storing fresh foods require, in most cases, refrigerated storage, and capacity is limited. So reductions in production for more than a week or two will be felt all along the value chain. Just-in-time supply chains will be severely tested. Building up storage at first seems like a good idea, but this will be expensive, and no one actor will want to take this on alone. Governments themselves don't want to get involved in storage programs either. Let me stop here with the reflection that I believe our supply chains for global foodstuffs are in fact more robust than is the current mental state of our global citizenry. When citizens are nervous, governments are nervous. Nervous governments act precipitously. Precipitous change is usually more xenophobic than smart. COVID-19 is a real threat to our individual health, both physical and mental. Equally importantly is that COVID-19 is a threat to our global governance. We are facing swift water, and the raft we ride on is unstable. The decisions taken in the next 12 months are very important. We all need to tighten our seatbelts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carl. We'll turn now to Ulla Kask.
Yes, good afternoon. So I will talk from the WTO perspective, but probably many opinions I will express are my personal. So you should not associate everything to WTO official positions. So what we do at the WTO, so we see this COVID-19 crisis clearly as a health crisis. So we give priority. We encourage members to take all the measures needed to fight this pandemic. But at the same time, we warn them that then when taking these necessary measures to fight the pandemic, they should be mindful of the impact those measures may have on trade flows, because what we fear is that if measures are not well thought through, they may have an impact on food security, and we may transform a current health crisis into food security crisis. The message, the important message also is that there seems to be, according to all the sources available, enough food globally. So it's important to make sure that food finds its way from where it's produced to where it's needed, and that obviously applies both to international trade, but also trade within the countries. So I make some few important, but simple but important points just to repeat our messages, that trade is crucial for food security, to guarantee food security. Not many countries can rely on their own productions. It's important for food security already in general, but in particular in a situation of crisis. Hence trade policies or trade-related policies obviously have an impact on trade flows, but they can have a positive impact, but they can also have, unfortunately, negative impact. So it's very important that now, during these important times, that members base their decision on the best available information. And that leads me to the third point, which is one of the core principles of the WTO, which is transparency. So WTO does a lot to make the information related to trade policies available, but obviously we need international cooperation, and it's good to see that other institutions are providing information about the food availability, food prices that complement our information, so as to allow the proper decisions, well-based, well-informed decisions to be taken. So what we need to do from the WTO perspective, so I focus myself more on trade-related measures and less on supply and consumption, on measures that have impact on supply or consumption. What we need to do, we basically need to at the WTO to reassure the members that there is enough food globally available. So for that, we need to provide adequate information. And it is interesting, actually, I don't know if you have been following, we recently released a trade outlook report that actually indicates they look at the three shocks, which is reduction of labor supply, reduction in demand and supply, and impact from trade measures, notably border measures. And they see that for food and food products, obviously the trade-related measures have the biggest impact, because demand is resisting, the demand is still there, people need to eat. So the biggest impact, and to see how quickly we can get out of this crisis, actually the main factor is for food products is the trade measures. So what WTO has been doing, we have been having the WTO, our Director General together with the Director Generals of FAO and WHO, World Health Organization, issued a joint statement calling for restraint in imposing export restrictions and food safety measures. There is also a joint statement with the World Customs Organizations, where the WTO and the World Customs Organizations promise to cooperate together to facilitate trade in essential goods. There is also many initiatives by the members taken to exactly to reassure the markets and the trading partners. And some of the interesting ones are a statement by Singapore and food importing country, and New Zealand and food exporting countries, whereby they call for elimination of customs duties on many essential goods. There is a annex with the products, which is mainly related to health goods, but also some food products, and they call for elimination of customs duties. They not applying export restrictions, and they also promise to intensify the discussions to actually remove all the non-trade tariff barriers on those products. And the last one I wanted to mention, it was actually yesterday, last night, there were a communication by 50 WTO members that led by Canada, that circulated a communication, and they committed by that communication not to apply any export restriction, and they committed to keep the supply chains open, and they also committed to provide information as soon as it becomes available. These last statements, communications, are open to all members. So what we see also from our members is that they actually want to send this reassuring signals to their trading partners that exporters, they commit not to impose those measures, so as to calm down or avoid any panic buying, because we know that if there is uncertainty about what members are going to do, uncertainty about available information, that leads to suboptimal policy decisions and lead to export, as we have seen in the past, to implementation of export restrictions, then in turn lead to higher price spikes, and we know from experience that these impact more the most vulnerable segments of population. So from our point of view, from the WTO point of view, I think it's very important that given that the food supplies globally seem to be adequate, that we keep the trade flowing and supply chains open and functioning, and we are mindful that of any COVID-19 related measures, we are mindful of their potential impacts on trade flows. Thank you.
Thank you, Ulla. For our next speaker, we're going to turn to Phil Riddell. Phil, the floor is yours for the next 4 minutes.
Thank you, Rachel, and hello, everybody. Thanks to Rachel and Martin for putting this important discussion together. I want to make it clear from the start that I'm not a food trade expert. My own expertise is more about water and land. But I do think the current pandemic is giving us a great opportunity to take a long, hard look at current orthodoxies, because without water and land, there wouldn't be any food. So we have to understand that any discussion about food trade is also a discussion about the trading of water and other factors of production that are embedded in the commodity being traded. So with everybody's permission, I want to come at this from a natural resource perspective. And I recall that UNEP's Green Economy team concluded quite early on in their work that trade is cross-cutting and that fair terms of trade are a determinant of success for pretty much everything else. And if we get trade wrong, success with other measures is likely to be limited. And during my own work with FAO on looking at long-term water and food security in the Nile Basin, we identified again fairly early on that terms of trade were one of two key determinants of food and water security in the basin, the other being the extent to which sector investments are enabled or constrained. We've moved on a little from that now. We question the nature of investments, but that's something else. So with that at the back of our minds, we need to understand that we only need to be self-sufficient in food at the global level. In theory, and it's certainly a very big theory, the closer we get to the point of consumption, the more diverse food security pathways appear and become. But these alternative food security pathways are all dependent on trade. And here's the important thing from my point of view, because trade is not just about food distribution. It's also about how best to extract value from land and water in the most advantageous and sustainable fashion. All right, so far so good. We know that not all trade is righteous. We have the slave trade, we have sex trafficking, but there is it is possible to think of trade as being potentially righteous, but righteous trade is currently being sacrificed on the altar of political economy of self-sufficiency, on protected agricultural markets. And on that, I wonder if anybody's attempted to calculate the water costs of protected markets. That's an interesting one going forward. Also on the altar are unhelpful terms of trade and persistent policy silos. Now, all of these things impact the extraction of value from natural resources, and they also have profound impacts on socioeconomics. They don't just have an impact on food security, but they also, and this is very important, particularly when we're discussing a subject such as this in the context of health, it also has profound impacts on nutrition security. And we do know that the wrong type of agricultural trade can in fact compromise nutrition security. But also there's a severe constraint on the sustainability of natural resource use, because the more value that is extracted, the more there is available to invest in sustainability. A poor farmer struggling to feed their family on low yielding rain-fed maize is more likely to extensify land use than to build terraces and restore organic content to depleted soils. This has implications, and I'll address in a specific question momentarily. But for the moment, to close my introductory comment, I think it's fair to say that the current pandemic is shining a very bright light on current orthodoxy in general, and on certain very significant shortcomings in particular. And if the experts are correct and pandemics are going to be very much part of our shared future, we have a real opportunity now to press the reset button on current orthodoxy. But before doing that, we've got to take a long and careful look at where that light is shining. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil. Next, we'll turn to our introductory statement from our final panelist, Eckart. The floor is yours.
Thanks to Rachel, and thanks to Rachel and Martin and AUB for putting this together. I want to focus in my remarks a bit, or want to put myself into the shoes of food import dependent countries in the MENA, and to which extent they fear repetition of the global food crisis 10 years ago in the current situation, and how they might react. The global food crisis about a decade ago was quite a shock to these countries. Not so much the food price hikes, but the food export restrictions that some agro exporters announced out of fear for their own food security: Russia, Argentina, Pakistan, Vietnam, and so on. That spooked them, and they reacted by increasing storage, by announcing agro investments abroad, as this kind of domestic food self-sufficiency illusion that they had pursued since the 1990s. Saudi Arabia doing crazy things like planting wheat in the desert and becoming the 6th largest wheat exporter at that time, and in fact exporting virtual water. So there was a true cost in terms of water security, to which to what Phil has just alluded. So that is not an option anymore. But clearly it has spooked them, and now the question is, how do they perceive the current situation? So if Joe and Ulla say, well, there is enough food, and Carl says, and the markets will work, they will bring it to you, they kind of say, well, I don't believe you, right? They have this kind of feeling, well, history has taught us we need to be cautious. And sometimes the memory go far back to the Second World War or to the 1970s, when the US politicized food trade, when there were debates about a possible food embargo in retaliation to the Arab oil embargo. They have seen the destruction that the multilateral UN embargo created in Iraq and to Iraqi food security at that time. So some of our kind of trade-based approach to food security that has its rationale, no doubt about it, and that is being repeated in academic circles and international organizations, is received with, or is taken with a pinch of salt, and again with some justification. So how do they see the current situation? I think overall they can be relatively at ease regarding food supplies. I don't see any threat to food availability. That was not even the case a decade ago. Yeah? It was more what the crisis did in the minds of people than what it did in reality. So farm production, especially the capital intensive production of cereals, is not really threatened, as Joe has pointed out. Some supply chains might face certain strains, but again, the supply chains in quite a few MENA countries are pretty modern. So I think they will be less disrupted than a traditional or transitional food supply chains with wet markets, with a lot of people congregating, with a lot of contagion, risk of contagion, and so on. So again, I think they are relatively on the safe side. What they fear, of course, are export restrictions, and Joe has mentioned there have been certain quotas, so that is certainly something they will be monitoring quite closely now, and they are afraid of it, especially what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. I think that is a concern, and we have seen it already in the announcements of increasing national storage, where there is, of course, a risk that if that is becoming a widespread phenomenon, they might create the very issue that they are afraid of. That means illiquid markets, yeah? That they kind of drain liquidity from spot markets into in order to feed their storages. So that might be something where international organizations can alleviate some fears, maybe by international storage solutions or international coordination of national storages. IFPRI at that time also suggested a virtual storage solution. So if we see any resurgence of export restrictions like a decade ago, I would expect renewed debates about such solutions. The real issue for food security, though, is not food availability, but food accessibility, even in richer countries in the MENA. And that food accessibility is not threatened by a lack of food, but because people do not have the income anymore to access food. These 250 million that Martin mentioned at the beginning, these people, they do not go hungry because there is not enough food. They cannot afford it anymore. They don't have income. So it's rather the economic knock-on effect of the corona crisis that has a real impact on food security, and where once again we see that Amartya Sen was right, that he said basically famines never happen because there's not enough food, but because people do not have access to food. And especially in developing countries, that's a much more salient issue because they cannot afford the kind of temporary relief payments that developed countries like the OECD can pay. So the real issue is really which people are vulnerable, and vulnerable people we even have in richer MENA countries like in the Gulf countries, migrant labor, for example. A lot of migrant labor right now does not receive a salary in the Gulf countries. So that's a real issue. Another very specific, so the region will need to think much more about safety nets and how they can alleviate the kind of economic knock-on effect, and for everybody, not just for specific segments of the population. And another very specific challenge in some countries of the region are sanctions. I'm talking mainly Iran, but also Syria. Sanctions do formally exclude food and medical supplies, but because of financial sanctions, the ability of these countries to import food is severely curtailed. Once you do not have access to trade finance, foreign assets are frozen. That's a real issue. And as I've mentioned at the beginning, the memories of past periods of sanctions are very fresh in the MENA region. So their inclination to believe the gospel of a trade-based approach to food security is not that much developed, and for some good reason. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Eckart. We'll pass back to Martin for now.
Excellent. Thank you very much for this highly interesting first round of introduction and perspective. I would like to ask Joe Glauber a question. And last week, the United States government has announced to stabilize the US agricultural sector with $19 billion. So in your perspective, how will this stabilize also the global market? Does it have a global impact, and can we be relaxed because the US administration pursued a very bullish strategy on agriculture?
I think the quick answer is no. I think these are large subsidies that are going to farmers to compensate price losses and things like that. But I don't think, in one sense, they're not really addressing the fundamental problems in the food system right now. And as I mentioned in my opening comments, those entail things like these meat processing plants and things like that, where I think trying to address those problems with biosecurity methods and other things would really help meat prices and pull up producer meat prices if you could address those. So these are temporary measures. I mean, yes, I'm sure at one level they certainly will help farm income in the U.S. Some of the analysts that were looking at COVID effects on farm income were suggesting that you might see drops of $20 billion or more. And I think these monies will go a long way in terms of trying to bring farmers back to what they might have been expected at the beginning of the year. But I don't really think it affects the bigger issues that are the fundamental issues of what the effects of containment and other things are having on these markets.
Thank you so much.
The next question we have is for Carl. Carl, we'd like your opinion. What do you think governments should be doing to let the private sector do its job to ship, distribute, and deliver food? And what risks do you see in terms of policy responses across the world that could threaten the functioning of the private sector?
Well, I guess, first of all, governments need to understand that the global food supply architecture has really been put together looking at redundancies, not only in national facilities and national supply chains, but very much on international supply chains. The company where I used to work, Bunge, felt that if we were to be a reliable supplier of vegetable oil, wheat, corn, rice, etc., we needed to be present in all of the various origins that could supply these products. So when there was a crop failure in, say, the Ukraine, Argentina could step in. And so the architecture that the private sector has put together has looked at knitting together all of these various different origins. When governments come in and say, yes, but my origin for my citizens is more important, and we will put export restrictions on, let's say, wheat out of Argentina, it basically goes at weakening the architecture that the global food chain was constructed to mitigate. Not only does it weaken the global situation, export restrictions in Argentina will certainly hurt the Argentine producer, will hurt the various different countries' opportunity to buy wheat. And while it certainly will reduce the price in the local market, subsidies to the local market are more effective rather than export restrictions. In other words, export more, get profit from these opportunities, government by government, and use these export receipts to reduce the price to the vulnerable people in each country. So governments need to understand the architecture of the system itself before they begin to have governmental measures to solve an immediate problem. That's why in my opening comments, I said precipitous actions by government really are more of a concern to the global architecture than anything else, because they don't quite always understand how the system is built, how the system has been designed to work. So, and I say they don't understand, and I mean that at a political level. Certainly, people like Joe in the US government and other officials in national governments, when I would talk to them, they would say, Carl, of course we understand that, but you don't understand. We have political pressure. So it is this political pressure and nervous citizens that need to be somehow tampened down. How do you assuage concerns without having unfortunate policy decisions? And that is easy for me to say and hard for governments to accomplish. So, but basically, to answer your question quickly, political level needs to understand how the system has been architectured, how the system has been built before they go about making changes to it.
Excellent, thank you very much. I would like to ask Ulla Kask the next question. Ulla, we've learned just from Carl about the private sector and so on. Obviously, one of the key issues in global food trade is transparency. And how do you see the current transparency? You mentioned that countries in the West, Canada, and so on are working on currency, but on transparency. But what about other countries? Especially countries in the global South. Is there this necessary transparency at the moment, and what kind of systems do we need to put in place in order to ensure this?
I will start maybe by saying that overall currently the transparency regarding the trade-related measures is better than it used to be, but it's clearly not optimal. We could definitely do better. Our members could do better, but it's clear also that for some smaller countries, so smaller developing countries, it's much more difficult to come up with the information or put together notification in a timely manner. So there are real constraints also why some we have delays with the notifications. Just regarding the transparency, the WTO, we have I can divide the answer in two parts. So we have the regular mechanisms that become very handy during the time of the crisis too, but the regular mechanisms to include the trade policy review mechanism that analyzes the country policies one by one. We have a monitoring exercise done also by the trade TPR division, which is done 4 times per year. We have notifications on the different WTO agreements. So notification, compliance with the notifications, I'm sorry for the noise, the compliance with the notification obligations has improved a lot as compared to the past, including notifications by developing countries. So there is a real improvement. We have now also online databases where actually members can provide information directly, so there's no delay, you know, between when they submit and we process and so on. And as you know, many agreements actually oblige members to have inquiry points where their trading partners can call and inquire about the measures in place. We also, WTO agreements also require members to publish their laws in a gazette or online, which also makes more information available. So there have been improvements regarding also the regular notification and information requirements. Now, during this crisis, what the WTO has done is to put, we have now COVID a web page dedicated to COVID-related measures. And these measures we are not waiting, while the Director General made a call for members to provide it, but we are not waiting for the members actually to submit information. So actually there is a team that actually goes and look for those measures and checks with the countries concerned if these measures they found, whether it was in press or elsewhere, so these measures have to be confirmed by the members. And we have a page, we have there close to 100 measures now in place that have been put on our website. Around 30 of those measures are related to agriculture. Not all these measures, which is a good news, go towards restricting trade. Many measures actually are trade facilitating measures. Members taking measures to facilitate trade procedures, or remove certain requirements, or reduce tariffs, especially on medical supplies, but also on food. So measures go in both directions. So overall, the transparency has been improving, but we are not there yet. Just to say where the measures we have been seeing, obviously there are many sanitary or phytosanitary measures. Some of them go towards facilitating trade rather than the opposite. We do see export restrictions. We have 4 countries who have officially notified: Ukraine, Thailand, Kyrgyzstan, and Egypt. We know there are some other export restrictions out there that have not been notified, and we also see increase in domestic support by certain countries, and we already mentioned one big member who has been announced a big amount of support to their farmers. So the risk also is that when we, as I said before, WTO calls for exercising restraint in applying these measures, and many exporting countries have committed themselves not to impose export restrictions. We see some measures still taken, and the risk is also how to separate measures that have been taken really for COVID, to fight the COVID crisis, and measures that might be taken for protectionist reasons that actually use this crisis to pull in the other direction. So overall, just to summarize, transparency on our end, we feel it's better than during the previous crisis, but we could definitely do better. And we recognize that some developing countries have serious constraints when putting together their notifications. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is for Phil. Phil, in your opening remarks, you commented that it's a good time to be questioning orthodoxies. So in your perspective, how do you think this pandemic will affect or redirect longer-term food security strategies? What types of actions or shifts in policy do you expect we might see moving forward?
Hello. I think there's a communication problem. Can people nod if they can hear me? Okay, good. How does this pandemic affect or redirect longer-term food security strategies? If we first of all, we've got to agree that we need a trade-based strategy for global food and water security. If we agree with that, and if we can also agree that massive new investments in agricultural land and water use are needed, and trust me, they will be in both the public and private sector, if the 9 billion people that Carl referred to are going to be fed, then as far as my own work is concerned, the question is all about pre-investment risk appraisal. In other words, has this pandemic revealed any weak spots? Well, we see chaos along the entire seed to food value chains, and that must have profound implications on financial and economic internal rates of return. Implications that were almost certainly not anticipated during the pre-investment appraisal and due diligence stages. And if these pandemics are going to be part and parcel of our shared future, we definitely need to understand the future risks on future investments and factor them into the pre-investment appraisal and to develop appropriate ways to mitigate them. Now, my team in Egypt has developed an extremely sophisticated investment appraisal tool with a huge suite of metrics that can actually incorporate pandemic risks and even apply a Monte Carlo risk simulation to them. But the ability of a model like this, even though it's cutting edge, can only tell us about the risk represented by a pandemic across a continuum of values. But this is meaningless without knowing more about the occurrence probability of those values. And this is something the epidemiologists have got to help us with. We're also going to need financing innovations, moving much further ahead with this new thing called blended finance. It needs to be taken to considerable scale as a means by which to de-risk the perceived risks of the private sector. The private sector is going to be increasingly important going forward because it is generally agreed that there are tremendous private sector opportunities in food supply and indeed in water security. At the Budapest Water Summit in 2016, a vice president of the EIB said he knew of this, listen to this, $20 trillion of investment that would go into water projects if only the pricing signals were known. Now, a pandemic drives a coach and horses through any pricing signal concept. We need to know a lot more about this going forward, and we need to have very robust financial mitigating measures, such as blended finance. So my closing comments to that particular question would be that a longer term trade-based food security investment strategy definitely needs a combination of good science with respect to the quantification of pandemic risk probabilities. And let's remember that they're going to vary with regions, and with regions that the trade-based value extraction is going to change also. So something that might have a profound impact on labor would be more important where agricultural production is more labor-based. We also need, along with that good science, as I've said, we need very innovative financial risk mitigation measures built in from the get-go. Thanks. Thank you,
Phil, for your remarks. Eckart, we would also like to ask you more about this geopolitical component, because we know this is your major research topic. Do you think that this current pandemic will either expose more the geopolitics of food? Will it strengthen existing traders and trade or exporting regions? And because we've learned a lot over the last few weeks about China and its influence over various international organizations and countries. So what is your take on, the perhaps emerging geopolitics, and how can then trade-dependent countries best equip themselves in this phase of the geopolitics of food? Will this strengthen the West, the American alliance, or the American sphere, or will there be also perhaps the Chinese and other countries emerging?
Well, I will keep it short, as I've alluded to some of these issues to my initial statement already. I think overall the likelihood for a kind of politicization of trading power, as we've seen a decade ago, is not as high, and the possibilities for a country like Russia, for example, to leverage its export potential in such markets and restrict it, or maybe try to use food export potential in a similar way as it has used its gas export potential. I don't see that at the moment. So I think there's much less possibility and less incentive for some countries to do so. Of course, the whole, let's say, geopolitical food trade map has changed compared to the 1970s. At that time, we were talking mainly about these kind of grain livestock complexes in the developed world, North America, some countries in Europe like France, Argentina and Australia. Now you have a new set of exporter nation from mainly tropical countries and sometimes different crops. Brazil at that time was rather just a sugar exporter. Nowadays it's also a major exporter of soybeans. Then this whole palm oil trade coming out of Malaysia and Indonesia. So some of these maps have changed. Also new rice exporters, or rice exporters with a much greater standing in a relatively illiquid market like Thailand or Vietnam, one could mention. But overall, I think this kind of politicization of food trade, also, mind you, American farmers were the big loser of that whole politicization in the 1970s. So generally, it's my impression that American farmers had enough since then of such politicization. Still, having said that, it could come back, especially with the current US administration.
Thank you, Eckart. We have a question from Maurice Saade. He's the FAO country director here in Lebanon. He has a question to Joe Glauber, and he's asking, do you anticipate India to restrict its rice export? What would be the impact on international rice prices, recalling India's actions in 2008?
Yes, no, and you're absolutely right. India was a big factor in, it was one of the early countries in 2008 that put on bans for rice, and that then did cascade into some of the other big Southeastern Asia exporters like Thailand, or like Vietnam and Thailand. Right now, I think the big concern in India is just movement of anything within the country because of all the lockdown procedures. The rice prices have crept up, but mainly indica rice, basmati rices, and some of the other, certainly the Thai rice have been lower prices. And I think at this point, no one is seen it. They've given no indications that there would be an export ban. Again, supplies are plentiful in the rice market. But they were plentiful in 2008. So we'll just have to see. I think the bigger problem right now with India, however, is just movement within the country. And we've seen the problems of food prices increasing in some markets just because there's not availability, but just because the food can't get to those areas. But export bans don't necessarily help that. So I mean, it's clearly something that will be monitored. One of the outgrowths of the 2007-8 price hikes in the 2010-11 price hikes was the creation by the G20 of this agricultural market information system. And there's a network of G20 market analysts. And so the US has been involved with that. Most of the major G20 countries, certainly the most major exporting countries, and India has been involved with that. And I think that hopefully there's a good exchange there and that we won't see the same sort of actions that we saw them take 10, 15 years ago.
Excellent, thank you very much. We have another question from one of our participants, Nathaniel Ferguson, and it goes to Karl Hausmann. You mentioned the need for smart regulations, and you also mentioned that the biggest challenges are global in nature. Smart national regulations can produce negative spillovers for other countries, and taken alone, they seem insufficient for these problems. Knowing this, is there a possibility for global regulation, and what bodies are well positioned to enact this regulation?
I need to remember to unmute myself before I begin to answer. Yeah, thank you for that question. The question is, how do we get to smart on a global basis? It is oftentimes easier to get to what might be considered smart on a national basis, but we need to do this on a global basis. Joe Glauber just mentioned that back in 2010, or I forget now exactly when it was, that the however many there were at the time, maybe G20, came up with this agricultural market information system. This had the potential to be smart, to aid people taking smart decisions. I guess I question, do people use this information as well as they should? Again, in moments of stress, when citizens are nervous, people are asking their country leaders to take a smart decision on a national basis without considering international. We need to understand that if the architecture of global food security or food security is in fact global in nature, we need to be smart on a global basis, not on a national basis. And that takes an understanding that we have, but we don't always live up to. So to answer the question on the table is almost as much a moral question as it is a technical question. How do we live up to our requirement to be smart on a global basis when our citizens are asking us to be smart on a national basis? And I have no answer to that other than to go back to questions of how do we put together a system of global morality that forces us to be smart on a global basis. The tragedy of the commons when we talk about climate change, pandemic reaction, global food security, they're easy to answer intellectually, but they're hard to put into place. How do you avoid the tragedy of the commons? And I wish I had an easy answer to that, but all I can say is we need to recognize that we must solve these issues on a global basis, not on a standalone national basis.
Excellent, thank you, Karl. I would like to hand over to David Zetland, who's a professor at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, excellent.
Great. Thanks everybody for this very interesting conversation. I think we all have a great idea of what to do as far as experts are concerned, but I'm asking kind of a political economy question. So I'm going to read a little bit of what I wrote for the question here. So sorry if I stumble. I consider COVID to be an anti-globalization virus. We've been talking about that today. And I'm curious about what you guys think in terms of the move towards autarky potentially and away from trade. And how crop mixes might change and how government policies might change. And then I have a wildcard question if you want to throw out there, what country might trigger a cascade of trade contraction by, for example, prohibiting export? So that's the gist of my question.
Thank you, David. Anyone who would like to volunteer to answer this question? Is COVID-19 an anti-globalization virus? Tough one. Anyone? Yes, Joe, please.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's easy to look at it that way, but I don't think so. I think at the end of the day, you look at the areas of the world that are big net importers, and they're going to continue to be big net importers. And I think that's with climate change and other things looking down the road, I think that's only going to make that issue greater, that there's going to be areas of the world that need supplies and are going to be willing to trade. I do think there's no question, I think this pandemic is going to change the global value chain. And I think that it's going to have to think about how to deal with these problems in the future, improve biosecurity protocols, increase flexibility, I think is another thing. But I think any moves towards self-sufficiency that we may see will be much like 2007-8. They'll be short-lived. And in answer to the last part of his question, I think the real danger, of course, is to see countries do take short-term actions. And there I would point to a region like the Black Sea, which is at least in the past have shown or have put on export bans, are currently putting on bans that I say aren't binding, but they supply 25% of the wheat. Look at Lebanon. I'm sorry, I don't want to take up all the time, but you look at Lebanon, 37% of the calories come from wheat. And of the wheat that is in Lebanon, 90% is imported, and 90% of that comes from Ukraine and Russia. So that's how important it is for Lebanon. Something like 30% of calories consumed in the country come from those two countries. So it's really important. Big wheat importers like the MENA region in general. Rice is another thing. So Vietnam and Thailand and India, if they were to sort of go into that would cause real problems, short-term problems like what we saw in 2008, 7 and 8. And I think we really want to avoid that. And I think that Ulla mentioned the 50 some odd countries that were signed on to agree not to have export restrictions. We tried to, out of the G20, we tried to get just an agreement among WTO members not to impose bans on humanitarian aid, and there we failed. And so hopefully this time around that we'll get better or stronger commitments to help there. And I, again, apologize for taking so much time.
Martin, I'd like to dive in as well, if I could. That was a very interesting question, by the way, David. It had three elements. I'd like to address two of them. I talked earlier about the water costs of protected agricultural markets, and we are seeing a little bit about the opening up of some markets. For instance, a part of Egypt's national water resource plan through to 2037 is to open up its domestic agricultural markets to all the riparian states upstream in the Nile. This is a tremendous leap forward for several reasons. It would be dreadful if that open-minded thinking becomes constrained now by the virus. But you also asked another very profound question about whether or not crop mixes will change. This is a crucial question from a natural resource management point of view. The problem is that any national food security sector, any questions or any thought of change in terms of national food security are politically very, very hazardous. I wonder then, and I'm hopeful that this pandemic is creating space for planners to ask questions: are we growing the right crops? What do you want that I can grow better than anyone else in a way that gives me the most holistic benefits? These are radical questions and were historically very hazardous for politicians and planners. And I just think we have a great opportunity to think in a new way. So David, thanks for the questions.
Do we have any other?
Yeah, maybe Carl Hausmann, if I could add one additional comment. David's comment that the COVID-19 is an anti-globalization virus. It is a cute comment, and I wrote that down. I'd like to save that for future use. However, I'd like to believe, I do believe, and I hope it turns out to be true. In fact, David, is just the opposite. This pandemic is telling us we must think globally. We cannot think nationally. People, whether you're in Lebanon, in Canada, in the US, in France and Italy, you can't close your border to some of the influences coming from the globe. Hopefully this, while the short-term effect is an anti-globalization virus, hopefully the long-term effect is it makes us roll up our sleeves and address more issues of climate change and sustainability of water and land resources for food production. So I think there is a good chance that in the long run, it is a pro-globalization virus, not an anti-globalization virus.
Can I say just a word too on that one?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Yes, just to, that I tend to agree, because what we see at the WTO is more, we talk a lot about export restrictions and so on overall. I don't mean necessarily at the WTO, but overall. And also, I think this viral COVID pandemic shows us at the WTO, why are there so many measures taken on the export side? It's because also disciplines, WTO disciplines on export measures are much weaker, almost non-existent, while on the import side, our disciplines are much stronger. And I think there will be a push. There have been already importing countries who have been pushing more for more disciplines on export measures, and I think this crisis will give them more arguments actually to push even harder for disciplining export measures as import measures have been disciplined in the past, right? Because we have strong commitments on import sides, but not on the export sides. And I see also from what members discuss, also this message that maybe they need to diversify the food sources, right? Not to rely on one market only, because this is where the risk steps in. Thank you.
I have a question, in fact, to Karl Hausmann. Well, from Rami Zarek, he's one of our, he's a former member of the high-level panel of experts to the World Food Committee based at FAO. He's asking, do you think that corporate traders can resist the irresistible urge to make more money on the back of this crisis? So do you think there's an opportunity which could be seized by the big traders?
Trying to make sure I don't give a glib answer to that question. No, I don't think corporate traders will resist the opportunity to make more money. However, I do think that the fact that there are several different participants in this, I mean, remember that corporate traders are competing against other corporate traders. And an opportunity to make a little bit more money is always seen as a way to make our own supply chains more profitable and therefore more resilient. But the competition sees the same thing. So therefore, I have often joked that for, boy, a penny a pound on vegetable oil, traders will kill for a penny a pound. And so if you think, oh, here is an opportunity to make more money, and somebody else says, oh boy, here is an opportunity for me to undercut my competitor, booking the trade is always more attractive than putting in a bid with what appears to be a higher profit margin, and then you end up not booking the trade. So because food supplies are plentiful, because, at least currently, because there is a lot of redundancy in the system in terms of export facilities, in terms of transportation, etc., and a lot of competition in the supply chain, I think that the architecture of the system will show that you end up not making more money. But the opportunity is traders genetically, they're attracted to making a little bit more. However, if you take any trading company, and Bunge and ADM as two public ones, you can take our statistics or take our financials and see what is their profit margin. I dare say profit margin in Bunge ADM is smaller than any other company, any other industry you can analyze. You look at what Procter & Gamble, Unilever, Nestle, et cetera, have as profit margin, and it is 5 times higher than what it is in the grain trading companies. So that is a little bit of a, like I said, a little bit of a glib answer that traders are always looking for profit opportunities, but competition there is great. And I don't think the opportunity therefore to increase margin substantially will be present.
Thank you very much, Carl. We have another question, a follow-up question from Maurice Saad from FAO. And this goes to Joe and Ulla. With an imminent global recession, do you expect a sharp drop in global food demand and hence prices, similar but not as sharp as oil prices?
Yeah, let me take a first shot at that, and I know Ulla will come in as well. But if you go back to the Great Recession, you know, ag trade was down in value by, I think, 10 or 12%. But you got to remember that, you know, the recession came right after those food price spikes, and so I think the decline in prices was as much due to the fact that global supplies really rebounded a lot in the, you know, with the harvest of 2008 and going into 2009. So I don't attribute that all to the recession. And in fact, if you look at the volume levels were only down 1.8%, and that's, boy, you look at manufacturing and you're off in double, you know, those were double-digit losses in volume, and the same with energy. So I don't think ag is as adversely affected because in a recession, just because people do eat and they may change their eating habits a bit, but I don't think that's the problem. I think COVID poses bigger issues in one sense, and understand, I think that we're talking short term, a much bigger drop in income or GDP world GDP than what we saw in the recession. So I don't want to minimize the impact on global ag trade, but I don't think it will be nearly as severe as what manufactured trade will go through, or certainly energy.
Ulla.
Yes, if I can add to that, it's our research division that has done some analysis on trying to forecast the impact on trade flows. And as I mentioned before, they factor in the decrease in demand, and what they have seen, yes, the decreasing demand for food products is much smaller. So when they do the trade forecast, they lump together all the merchandise trade. But if and it goes down, they have different scenarios, and it goes down according to the most pessimistic scenario by 30%. But it's mainly non-agricultural products. So food, in the case of their forecast, demand will decrease, trade flows will also decrease, but much less than for other products, because as Joe mentioned, people have to eat. And they looked at that also, they tried to play around with different scenarios to see how we are going to get out of this crisis. And they see, as I said, that for food products, the trade measures, border measures, play a much bigger role than actually a drop in demand when doing the forecast.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I have a question. Oh, no, I have a question. I would like to ask a question on behalf of Michael Segawa. He's one of our students joining us from Uganda today. And he's asking, in Uganda and elsewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, there's a lot of smallholder agriculture. And his question is whether this agricultural system could actually prove to be a way to be more resilient in such a time of COVID-19. So what are the specific impacts on Africa? If, maybe, I know Phil Riddell, you've worked in Africa, maybe you can kickstart on this question.
Small land holdings, and I know Uganda very well. I think only in the shortest of short terms will these micro farms have any sense. When by shortest of short terms, I mean perhaps this coming season. We have to. Okay, let me start. What I'm about to say, I am not suggesting that there is no future for small farmers. We have to make small-scale agriculture more attractive to prevent or slow down rural-urban migration. That's a fact. But we do know that just because land is fragmenting, that doesn't mean to say that small farming is wrong. The problem is there is going to be a minimum size. And those of us that know Chris Perry will know that he asked a very clever question that if we look forward, say, to 2050, what sort of size small farm is necessary for a farming family to achieve, say, 30% of domestic GDP per household? And he thinks that a small farm then to be sustainable is going to be 30 to 50 hectares. So yes, it may well be that a family with a small farm that have planted wisely will get through this next season, but we need economic and social connectivity for the small farms. In order to extract better value from the natural resources, they've got to have access to higher grade markets. We know that when there are higher grade markets, they make more money. And there are several examples. Those of us that were at the River Basin Organization Conference, the 7th one in South Africa, at the SADC region a couple of years ago, we learned about butternut farmers that had shifted from maize to butternuts with an increase in income of 600%. Those of us that were at the Doherty Institute conference on food and water security in Washington a couple of years ago learned similar examples from India. So small farms, yes, there is a minimum size. That minimum size is going to increase going forward, but small farms have immense value if they're producing the right crops, and trade is available to the farmers on those small farms. But any immediate advantage with the virus, I think, is going to be extremely short term.
Anyone else who would like to answer the question about resilience in sub-Saharan Africa? No? Then I would like to unmute Professor Tony Allen, who joined us from London. He sent in a question yesterday. But perhaps he can ask this question in person. Tony, are you with us?
I am. Can you hear me? Yes, I see my picture has come up. So should I start? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. This event, this COVID event, is similar in scale to the 2008-2011 crisis and to the 1970s crisis, where it was an oil-led crisis. The other one was a finance-led crisis. This one is a pandemic crisis. What we discovered in those other two crises was that the food system, which perhaps wasn't recognized so much as dysfunctional in the 70s, we now know is dysfunctional and unsustainable. I'm not saying to professionals like Carl that he's unprofessional. It's just that the framework, the financial framework, that he works in makes it that unsustainable things keep in place. Now, people are wondering, and a number of the questions have been: is the COVID event going to make things or have a different outcome from those other two? And I'm sorry to say that this this old system has been constantly evolving. It's 4,000 years old, the food system. It's been fixed in major ways in the big crises and in other ways all the way through. It's a system that keeps politicians in power and food consumers deluded that everything's all right. And that's the foreground story. The background is the environmental and low-income situation in the food supply chain. But what I can see, and just the dramatic thing about this crisis is that no one ever said, well, they did say you've got to close down the airlines, you've got to close down just about everything, but no one said you've got to close down the food supply chain. So it's doing a brilliant job. Fortunately, it's a non-inflationary period. Prices of food are low and the stocks seem to be fine. So I was very interested to see David Beasley from the World Food Programme came in a couple of days ago, making good use of a crisis, which we all should do because that's the only way that politics gets moved. But he's really the only voice. Certainly he would be out of kilter with the discussion today. So am I right? Do you agree that it will take a very short time for the food supply chain to get back, just months to get back into what it was 3 or 4 months ago? And we should take advantage of it, but won't be able to because the United States, you talked about 19 billion being found. Well, it's an envelope of at least 30 billion to fix US farmers. Well, 30 billion is nothing compared with 2 trillion or much more to put the other enterprises in place. So we have a situation in which this particular blip is going to be forgotten in terms of food very soon indeed. I overemphasize to get attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Maybe I direct this question to Carl first.
Okay. Thank you. The couple comments. The part of the food chain that I represent, I liked when Eckart made a distinction between availability of food and access availability. I don't want to avoid the question that Tony presented, but I represent the availability side of the food chain. If the people that David Beasley represents is the accessibility, that is another part of the value chain that I really can't speak to. I don't see personally a need to change the availability side, partly because I also agree fully with what Phil Riddell was saying, that from a sustainability point of view, the availability side of the food chain needs to look at where are resilient lands that can be farmed sufficiently to produce food for 9 billion people. Where are the sustainable rainfalls available to irrigate the farmland that we need? And this forces us to look at a global food chain, and which I think the private sector has done very quickly. In fact, I used to often say that sustainability on the food availability side of the chain is not a concept that is difficult to understand. Sustainability is, can you sustain production at these levels? And that quickly goes to resilient land and available rainfall, because doing it all with irrigation is not a sustainable way forward to feed 9 billion people. The accessibility side is a totally different issue. And I don't want to say, I'd like to say as a human being, I feel solidarity or some sympathy, empathy, certainly for the people who don't have this availability, accessibility, but we need to start thinking, how do we knit together a society in which all of us have more accessibility? But I personally think that the availability side, where are the lands and the water, natural rainfall to produce food for 9 billion people, is something that the grain companies have been looking at. And understand quite well. So if you accept, Tony, that I can cut the question into availability from accessibility, and with thanks to Eckart for giving those two different concepts, I don't think the problem of accessibility can be imputed to the upstream value chain that is focused on availability.
Thank you, Carl. Anyone else who would like to answer this question? Yes, Joe, please.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I thought Carl's comments were right on. I just, in all fairness, to those who are looking at this as a potential crisis, I think that it is the accessibility problem. It's not so much the food supplies, but the fact that income levels will fall. And you look at the progress on malnutrition that has been made over the last 20 years or so. There are some estimates, including some put out by my group at the International Food Policy Research Institute, that suggests a large global recession could push a lot of very, very poor households back into malnourishment, and where you could potentially be set us back some 10 years in sort of the progress that has been made there. That's not a question of availability. Food is there. It's a question of not enough income for some of those households. And so I think that will be a big concern, and that's going to hit sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia and other areas where we've seen traditional poor populations. But again, it's not a question of food availability, I don't think.
Thank you. Anyone else who would like to volunteer? Otherwise, I have a question for Eckart. Will current volatility in oil prices have a lasting impact on the ability for oil-dependent countries to finance imports? I ask this question from the understanding that while some of price dive is attributable to COVID-related demand shock, this cannot account for the entire decrease.
How oil prices affect food prices, or what?
Well, whether the whether falling oil prices will be impacting it
depends, like there are different oil exporting countries, right? In Venezuela, which was already in dire straits before and doesn't have a lot of foreign assets, yes, it might really affect food availability even, and certainly food accessibility. In the case of the rich rentier states of the Gulf, I see a lot of buffer. Yeah, I mean, first of all, because they have such a high rent endowment per capita, but also because they have very substantial foreign assets that they can use, and they are using them right now. They are repatriating assets, or they are taking recourse to debt issuance because the oil income is not enough. Another question are the so-called, let's say that the very rich rentiers, Qatar, UAE, Kuwait, not a problem at all. The middling rentiers like Saudi Arabia and Oman, well, they need to spend more compared to their export earnings than before, but they will be able to finance food imports. Then the poor rentier states that only have such a high oil dependence because they do not produce much else, and where the per capita endowment of oil rent is not that high. Well, there might be some trade-offs involved, or the budgetary situation might be considerably tighter. I've mentioned Venezuela already. In the Middle East, we would talk about countries like Libya, like Yemen, like Syria, like Iran, like Iraq. That's something to watch closely. Yemen, the food security situation is already extremely alarming, although not because of oil or lack of oil income. In Iran, I've mentioned already this issue of sanctions, which is certainly something that impedes free trade of free flow of food trade as well, although it's not directly targeted, as I've said.
Thank you very much. I have a final question from Dr. Tony Coleman, who was a member of parliament in the UK. He mentions that the speakers have concentrated on crop agriculture. Given that COVID-19 came from live animal bushmeat agriculture, does the panel see the phasing out of live animal exports, and how will this impact on countries dependent on it, such as the Gulf states? Will it encourage the move to cell and crop-based meat, so plant-based meat? Anyone? Any volunteers? Anyone who can answer?
I jump in, although I'm not a livestock expert, but what I find striking is that we name all these pandemics of the recent past after animals. Yeah, the bird flu, the swine flu, mad cow disease, and so I think that's food for thought. We clearly need to think about how we kind of produce meat and how we consume it. And I don't think it's just the bushmeat market. In that case, yes, but in the other cases, it was rather the factory meat sector. And I think this whole debate about how sustainable this current level of meat consumption is, and the answer is it's not. 70% of global agricultural land is being used for meat production, be it as to produce fodder or as rangeland. So yes, I think the world, we don't need to turn all into vegetarians, but I think people should eat less meat, and the meat they eat should be raised in a more ethical fashion, and maybe in some cases, yes, the sanitary standards of such wet markets also need to be considered. But I don't think it's just the bushmeat market, but generally the way how humankind is producing and consuming meat in general.
Thank you very much, Eckart. Anyone else who would answer this question, which is, you know, a bit speculative?
I'd just like to say that I very much support Eckart's response to this. In fact, maybe shame on me, but the whole term of wet meat markets, wet markets, I had to look that up. What is a wet market? We don't have many of them in the Washington area. The issue of how much meat we are eating, though, is absolutely has been pushed front and center over the last 10, maybe even 20 years by a lot of people due to the sustainability of meat production. But that gets back to what citizens are wanting to buy. And so far, it is convincing people to eat less meat is a lot harder than explaining to the availability side why excessive meat production is not as sustainable as a reduced meat consumption. I absolutely understand that, but you need to get citizens to want to eat less meat. We could certainly get by with less meat in our diet than we have today. In fact, we probably would all be healthier if we did that. But I liked Eckart's answer very, very much.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to end this seminar now. Thank you very much for all your great contributions. It was really food for thought. Before we part, I would like to mention that we have another seminar or further seminars coming up in the next few weeks. Next week, we are going to look at impacts of COVID-19 on food in the global south, food security in the global south. And we have Vanessa Ampinotti from Brazil. We have Vandana Shiva from India. We have Rami Zurek from Lebanon and Ibrahim Bahati from Uganda and Mustafa Abdirahman from Somalia. To really discuss the current impacts, especially given also the locust crisis in sub-Saharan Africa and East Africa in particular. So please join us again, those of you who have joined us today from YouTube or from other sources, Facebook. Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure. And if we were in a classroom, we would now all provide you with a round of applause. However, that's not possible. So we just have to say thank you very much and hopefully see you again in person, and stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
Bye-bye, Martin.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Thank you.
Okay.